Ryan Foster had always been a night owl. When he was offered the graveyard shift at the old manufacturing plant, he thought it would be the perfect fit. The plant had been mostly abandoned for years, with just a skeleton crew working during the day. Ryan's job was simple: monitor the security cameras, check the perimeter, and make sure no one entered the plant after hours. He was told it would be a quiet shift, something he could handle with ease. But tonight, something felt off. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows of the security room as Ryan sipped his coffee. He wasn't bothered by the cold. It was something he had grown used to in his 6 months working the night shift. He had seen it all: raccoons rummaging through the trash, the occasional stray cat wandering the yard, and the faint, unsettling noises that came with working in a decaying building. The plant had been abandoned after a tragic fire many years ago, and there were rumors that it was haunted. But Ryan didn't believe in that nonsense. He just wanted to get through his shift. At 2:13 a.m., the motion sensor alarm in Zone 4 blared. Ryan jumped, his heart skipping a beat as the monitors flickered. He turned to look at the screen showing the west hallway. It was a wide corridor lined with old, rusted machines. The motion sensor had been triggered, but there was nothing on the screen. Just the eerie silence of the plant. Ryan frowned, leaning forward in his chair. He adjusted the controls, zooming in on the hallway. And then, there it was, something small, darting across the floor. At first it looked like a trick of the light, but as he focused he could make out the faint outline of a figure moving quickly in the shadows. Probably just a raccoon or something, Ryan muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. He wasn't in the mood for some supernatural nonsense. He grabbed his flashlight and stood up, deciding to check it out. If it was an animal, he would take care of it and move on with his night. The hallway was dimly lit, the old lights buzzing faintly above. Ryan's footsteps echoed in the silence as he walked toward the source of the motion. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. It felt heavier than usual tonight, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. He passed the first set of machines, their rusted gears unmoving. As he moved deeper into the hallway, the sound of his boots tapping against the concrete floor was the only thing he could hear. The silence seemed to press in on him from all sides, making him feel small and insignificant. It was then that he heard it, a faint giggle, like that of a child. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "That's not possible," he muttered, trying to rationalize what he had just heard. The plant was empty. There were no children here. He was sure of it. But the sound was clear, almost like it was coming from behind him. He turned quickly, his flashlight sweeping across the dark hallway. The beam caught nothing but more shadows. He strained his ears, listening carefully. The giggle came again, this time from the far end of the hallway. It was soft, almost playful, but there was something sinister about it. Ryan's instincts told him to leave, but curiosity got the better of him. He had to see what was going on. The giggles grew louder as he made his way toward the source. He rounded a corner and found himself in front of a large storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of the giggling was unmistakable now. Ryan pushed the door open with caution, his flashlight illuminating the room. Inside, the room was filled with shelves of old, forgotten supplies. Boxes of equipment, faded documents, and broken furniture cluttered the floor. But there, in the center of the room, was something strange. A small figure, no taller than a child, stood motionless in the middle of the room. It was dressed in a tattered white gown, its hair hanging in matted tangles. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure's pale, featureless face. There were no eyes, just smooth, empty skin where eyes should have been. The giggles stopped. Ryan stood frozen, unable to move. His heart raced as the figure slowly turned its head toward him, its body jerking unnaturally. He could feel the cold, suffocating presence of something not human in the room with him. The flashlight in his hand flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Who are you?" Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its body twitched and contorted, as if it was struggling to move. Then, without warning, it took a step toward him. Ryan's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, trapped in the presence of something he couldn't explain. The figure's mouth slowly opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Suddenly, the light in the room went out. Darkness consumed him. Ryan stumbled backward, his hands scrambling to find the door. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, growing closer, faster. His pulse pounded in his ears as he finally managed to reach the door and escape into the hallway. But as he turned to run, he felt something cold brush against the back of his neck. The giggling returned, louder than before. He ran through the dark halls, his flashlight flickering and dying in his hands. The sound of footsteps echoed in pursuit. Every turn he took, the figure seemed to be right behind him, always just out of reach. Ryan's mind raced as he reached the security room, slamming the door shut behind him. But it was too late. The figure was already inside. Josh Hadley had been a night security guard for over 5 years, but this was his first assignment at the harbor. The docks had a reputation, not for smuggling or criminal activity, but for the eerie stories locals whispered about the place. They spoke of phantom lights on the water, disembodied voices, and shadows that moved against the tide. Josh dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. Ghosts didn't pay his bills. His job was straightforward: monitor the containers, patrol the warehouses, and keep unauthorized people off the premises. Most nights it was quiet, except for the occasional sound of waves lapping against the docked ships. But tonight was different. The shift began as usual. Josh sat in the small security booth, flipping through the surveillance monitors. The harbor was vast, a labyrinth of shipping containers stacked high like steel tombstones. The monitors showed nothing out of the ordinary. A ship was docked at Pier 7, its massive hull looming in the darkness. The vessel was supposed to be empty, awaiting a morning crew for unloading. At 1:27 a.m., Josh noticed something odd on the monitor covering Pier 7. A figure moved between the containers. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but distinct enough to catch his attention. He leaned closer, adjusting the camera angle. The figure was gone. "Probably a trick of the light," he muttered, though his gut told him otherwise. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, Josh stepped out into the cold night air. The salty breeze carried an unusual stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. He walked toward Pier 7, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The towering containers cast long, eerie shadows under the sparse floodlights. As he approached the pier, he heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the radio or the wind. It sounded human, soft and low, but the words were unintelligible. "Hello?" Josh called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. The whispering stopped. Josh scanned the area with his flashlight. The beam caught nothing but the sides of containers and the edges of the ship. He climbed onto the gangway leading to the ship's deck. The metal groaned under his weight, amplifying the silence around him. Once on board, the whispers returned, louder now. They echoed through the ship, coming from below deck. Josh hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but his sense of duty overrode his fear. He descended the narrow stairs into the ship's hold, the whispering growing louder with each step. It sounded like multiple voices now, all speaking at once. The flashlight flickered as he entered the hold. The space was vast and empty, its metal walls damp and rusting. The whispers stopped abruptly. "Anyone here?" Josh asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. Then he saw it, carved into the floor, a massive symbol. It looked ancient, a circular pattern filled with strange runes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Around the edges of the symbol were small, scattered objects, broken chains, a child's toy, and what looked like a sailor's hat. Josh stepped closer, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. His flashlight flickered again, then died completely. Darkness engulfed him. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. They surrounded him, overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words. Josh's breathing quickened as he fumbled to turn the flashlight back on. A cold hand brushed against his arm. Josh froze. "Who's there?" he demanded, spinning around. The whispers stopped, replaced by a guttural, inhuman growl. The darkness seemed to shift, and for a split second, Josh saw something. A tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes staring at him from the corner of the hold. He bolted, scrambling up the stairs and back onto the deck. The whispers followed, growing louder and more aggressive. As he ran down the gangway, he glanced back and saw the figure standing at the ship's edge, its eyes burning like embers in the night. Josh didn't stop running until he reached the security booth. He locked the door, his hands shaking as he tried to radio for help. The static-filled reply from his dispatcher was barely intelligible, but he managed to convey that something was wrong. Minutes felt like hours as he sat in the booth, clutching the flashlight as if it could protect him. The whispers continued outside, circling the booth, punctuated by the occasional tap on the glass. When the morning shift arrived, they found Josh sitting in the corner of the booth, pale and trembling. He couldn't explain what had happened. The ship was inspected, and nothing out of the ordinary was found. The carvings in the hold were gone, and the cameras showed no record of the shadowy figure. Josh quit that day, vowing never to work a night shift again. But as he left the harbor, he swore he could hear faint whispers in the wind, calling his name. Lena had been working as a night nurse at St. George's Hospital for nearly a year. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid well, and the night shifts were quieter. The hospital had a long history, one of healing, yes, but also of tragedy and untold stories. Nurses often told tales of strange happenings after dark, of patients who passed away and returned to haunt the hallways, or of things that went bump in the night. Lena never put stock in such stories. She was a woman of reason, with a medical degree and a strong will. But this night, this one night, would change her forever. It was just past midnight when the first odd thing happened. Lena was alone in the emergency room, scanning through patient charts, when she heard footsteps echoing down the hall. A chill crawled up her spine. She glanced at the clock. No one was due for a round until 2 a.m. Curious, she stepped out into the corridor. The footsteps stopped immediately. "Hello?" she called. No answer. Thinking it was just another tired doctor or nurse passing by, she returned to her desk. But as soon as she sat down, the footsteps began again, closer now. The sound was deliberate, slow, as if someone was dragging their feet. Lena stood up, heart racing. She left the office and started down the hallway, scanning every corner. She knew the building inside out, and she was sure there was no one else around. The hallway was dark and empty, except for the glow of the emergency lights. She turned the corner only to find a door to one of the patient rooms slightly ajar. It was room 206, the room where a patient, Mr. Benson, had passed away earlier that evening. Lena hesitated. It wasn't uncommon for patients to pass away during the night, but Mr. Benson's death had been particularly disturbing. The elderly man had been found in a state of extreme distress, clutching at his chest, muttering something about the shadows before he died. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the hospital, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The light flickered, and in the dimness, Lena saw a figure sitting in the bed. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't move. "Mr. Benson?" she whispered, stepping closer. The figure turned slowly toward her. The face was pale, lifeless, its eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. A thin, bloodless smile crept across his face, and then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he spoke. "They're waiting for you." Lena stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The figure in the bed suddenly sat up, its movements jerky and unnatural. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows behind him, growing louder and louder. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She turned and fled, running down the hall as fast as her legs would carry her. She had to get out. She had to leave. But no matter how fast she ran, the hospital seemed to stretch on forever, its walls closing in around her. Lena reached the elevators, but when she pressed the button, nothing happened. The lights above the elevator flickered, and then the door opened with a soft, metallic creak. Inside, the elevator was empty, but the air was thick with the smell of something foul. Rotting, decaying. Before she could step inside, the doors slammed shut, trapping her. She screamed, pounding on the metal doors, but no one came. The elevator began to move, descending deeper into the hospital's lower levels. As it descended, Lena felt a strange sense of unease. She had never been in the lower levels of the hospital before. The building had always felt like it was alive, moving, breathing. But tonight, something felt different. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. Lena stepped out into a hallway she had never seen before, a dimly lit corridor stretching out before her. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white pictures of patients who had passed away long ago. But there was something off about them. In each photo, the faces seemed to change, warping into grotesque versions of themselves, eyes bulging, mouths twisted in silent screams. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder and more frantic. They filled the air, echoing from every corner of the hallway. Lena turned, trying to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, the end disappearing into darkness. A door opened behind her, and she turned to face it. Inside the room was a figure, a woman standing at the foot of a bed, her back to Lena. The woman was humming softly, a tune Lena couldn't place. Slowly she turned around. Her face was pale, lifeless, and her eyes were hollow, staring straight into Lena's soul. "Welcome," the woman whispered. Before Lena could react, the hospital's lights flickered and everything went black. When Lena woke up, she was back at the nurse's station. The clock read 6 a.m. The hospital was quiet, normal, but the whispering continued. Chris had always been a night owl, so working security at the Harper Industries warehouse seemed like a perfect job. Nestled on the edge of a small town, surrounded by thick woods, The massive facility had once been a hub of industry. Now it was a relic, its towering shelves lined with forgotten machinery and outdated equipment. For Chris, it was simple work. Monitor the cameras, walk the perimeter, and keep trespassers out. But the warehouse had a reputation. Over the years, guards had quit unexpectedly, sharing tales of odd sounds, flickering lights, and shadows that didn't belong. Chris had dismissed these stories as the overactive imaginations of bored workers. He wasn't one to scare easily, and the paycheck was worth the solitude. The night in question started like any other. A storm was brewing, lightning flashing in the distance as Chris settled into the small security office. The monitors displayed grainy images of the warehouse's interior. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, cloaked in darkness, except for the occasional overhead light that buzzed and flickered. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound filling the room as the storm outside intensified. Chris sipped his lukewarm coffee and glanced at the monitors. Everything was as it should be, silent and still. At 1:47 a.m., something changed. One of the monitors flickered, the static giving way to an image that sent a chill down Chris's spine. In Section 3B, a shadow moved. It wasn't the kind caused by a shifting light or a swaying tarp. It moved with purpose, darting across the screen. Chris leaned forward, squinting at the image, but the shadow was gone. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe a rat or a stray bird had found its way inside. But as he leaned back, the monitor flickered again. This time the shadow appeared closer to the camera. It had a shape now, vaguely humanoid but distorted, as if something was mimicking human form but getting it wrong. Chris felt his heart race. He grabbed his flashlight and radio, muttering under his breath, "Let's see what's out there." The warehouse was colder than usual, the air heavy with the smell of damp metal. Chris's boots echoed loudly as he walked towards Section 3B. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of dusty shelves and forgotten machinery. "Anyone in here?" he called, his voice bouncing off the metal walls. No answer. He reached the area where he'd seen the shadow. The space was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder. Chris swept his flashlight over the shelves, the beam catching on a pile of tarps. For a moment he thought he saw movement, but when he pulled the tarp away, there was nothing there. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete. It was coming from the far end of the section, where the shelves ended and an open space led to the loading dock. Chris followed the sound, his grip tightening on the flashlight. As he approached the dock, the sound stopped abruptly. Chris scanned the area, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Rain pounded against the metal roof, the storm now in full force. He turned to leave, convinced it was just his imagination. That's when he felt it, eyes watching him. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Slowly he turned his flashlight toward the corner of the loading dock. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was crouched low, its pale skin stretched tight over a gaunt frame. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" Chris shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Its hollow eyes seemed to absorb the light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It let out a guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the warehouse. Chris stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. The figure stood, unfolding like a nightmare brought to life. It was taller than any human, its elongated limbs ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. He ran. Chris sprinted through the warehouse, his boots slipping on the slick concrete floor. The creature's footsteps echoed behind him, impossibly fast. He turned corners blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights flickered overhead, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to dance in mockery of his fear. He reached the security office and slammed the door shut, locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. No signal. The growling outside the door grew louder, more guttural. Chris backed away, his eyes darting to the monitors. The cameras showed static, all except one. On that screen, the creature stood just outside the door, staring directly into the lens. Its eyeless face seemed to mock him, and then it raised one clawed hand and dragged it slowly down the door. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. The lights in the office flickered, then went out completely. Chris was plunged into darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then the doorknob began to turn.